Have you ever known what it feels like to be truly alone? Not just without company, but carrying the weight of loss that echoes in every corner of your home. Imagine a woman, Clara Whitmore, living for years on the vast Texas plains. Her only companions, the memories of a husband and child, buried on the hill behind her cabin. The wind was her only witness, silence, her constant companion. But what happens when that silence shatters, when 9 Comanche warriors ride out of a blizzard, not demanding battle, but asking for shelter? What choice would you make? Bolt the door and risk their wrath, or open it and place your very life in their hands? And later, when ruthless men came to steal her land and her water, what would you do if the same warriors returned, not as strangers, but as protectors? If it were you, standing alone on that prairie, would you have had Clara's courage, or would the silence have swallowed you whole? Stay with us, because this story is about more than survival. It's about loss, resilience, and the fragile beginnings of love in the most unlikely place. If this tale already stirs your heart, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the journey. Out on the relentless plains of the Texas Panhandle, beneath a sky so wide and pitiless it seemed to swallow the earth, a lone woman cast the only shadow that proved she was still alive. For 5 long years, Clara Whitmore had spoken to no one but the whisper of the wind and the memory of voices she could no longer hear. She lived like a ghost, tucked away in a land that devoured the weak and forgot the strong. But one bitter afternoon, when an early blizzard rolled down across the flat country with the fury of a wild beast, her silence was broken, not by a passing neighbor, nor a wandering settler, but by the solemn figures of 9 Comanche horsemen, their faces streaked with paint, their dark eyes colder than the storm itself. They did not come to raid. They came seeking shelter. The Llano estacado carried a silence that was more than the absence of sound. It was a weight pressing on the sod roof of Clara's small cabin, sinking into the log walls and into her very bones. It was the silence she had lived with since her world had shattered, broken only by the scream of a hawk, the scamper of a jackrabbit through sagebrush, or her own low voice as she tended 2 simple wooden markers on the hill behind her home. Silas Whitmore, beloved husband, Eli Whitmore, their cherished son. The wind had already begun to erase the carved letters, just as the years had dulled the sharp edge of grief into a steady, enduring ache. Silas had been buried after a rock slide claimed him on a reckless hunt for silver far to the north. Little Eli, just 4 years old, had been taken by fever in the same bed where Clara now lay alone. Her life had shrunk to the borders of her claim, one small cabin, a stout corral, a garden she kept alive through sheer will, and the vast, indifferent prairie stretching into eternity. She was 42, though her face carried the lines of someone older. The wind and sun had marked her skin. Her hands were strong but rough, and her movements carried the precision of someone who had learned to live without help. She could track game, butcher it clean, till soil hard as stone, and wield her Winchester with a steady hand. There was no one else to do it for her. The nearest settlement, Prosperity Ridge, lay 2 days' ride away. Clara traveled there rarely, just enough to fetch flour, salt, and coffee. Folks in town looked at her with a blend of pity and suspicion. A woman alone was something they could not quite accept. They called her the ghost of the Llano. Clara never argued. Ghosts were left to themselves. That late autumn afternoon, she paused at the water pump, noticing how the northern sky had taken on a sickly greenish hue beneath the bruised clouds. The air grew still, unnaturally cold for October. She knew what it meant. A blue norther, one of those sudden plunges in temperature that could turn the prairie into a frozen wasteland in a matter of hours. She moved quickly, stacking wood inside, latching the shutter, checking the door, and filling Molly's feed. Her hands moved out of habit, survival rituals etched into muscle memory. As the snow thickened outside, she lit the lamp and set a pot of venison stew on the stove, bracing herself for the long night. Dusk settled with the wind screaming like a living thing around her cabin. Inside, the glow of the kerosene lamp fought back the darkness. Clara told herself she was safe. She had endured storms before. But just as that thought settled, Molly gave a wild, terrified bray in the lean-to. Clara froze, hand hovering above the stew. That was no coyote call. It was a deeper fear, reaching for the Winchester, its cold weight steadying her. She moved to the peephole in the door. At first, only the snow danced before her eyes, thick and blinding. Then the storm revealed shapes small, wiry ponies, unshod, their riders hunched against the wind. 9 men, tall and broad, their robes heavy with snow, their hair bound with feathers. Paint marked their faces in black and crimson, the colors of war. They were Comanche, and there were 9 of them. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, a trapped bird desperate to escape. This was what she feared more than loneliness, more than hunger. These were the masters of this land, their claim older than the graves of her family, older than the state itself. They sat unmoving, silent in the blizzard, their eyes fixed on the only shelter for miles. They had not yet attacked. They waited, and she knew they could see the lamp burning, the smoke curling from her chimney. To deny them would be to invite disaster. To let them in might mean placing her life in their hands. They would know she was inside. The smoke from her chimney and the glow of lamplight made any attempt at pretense useless. Clara Whitmore's heart thudded like a war drum as she weighed her choices. If she barred the door, they might burn her out or wait until the storm itself did the job for them. If she opened it, she would be one woman hemmed in by 9 hardened warriors. Either way, her life teetered on a knife's edge. Her eyes drifted to the small wooden bird resting on the mantel, the one little Eli had carved with his clumsy 4-year-old hands. She thought of Silas, too, steady as oak, who had always told her, "Courage ain't about never feeling fear. It's about doing the right thing when fear sits heavy in your chest." Clara clenched her jaw. The right thing was never easy, but it had to be faced. The largest of the riders swung down from his pony, even through the thick wall of snow. She could see his height and the way he carried himself, shoulders squared like a man accustomed to command. His face, weathered as stone, bore streaks of red and black paint, yet his movements held no menace. He stepped forward slowly, each stride steady and deliberate until he halted a short distance from her door. Then he lifted his hand, palm open, the universal mark of peace. The gesture seemed at odds with the fierce paint on his skin, but the meaning was unmistakable. Clara pressed her lips together, forcing a shaky breath into her lungs. She slid the Winchester against the wall, close enough to seize in a heartbeat if need arose. Her fingers fumbled with the heavy wooden bar across the door. With a grunt of effort, she lifted it clear and eased the door open just a crack. The storm slapped her face with icy fingers, trying to wrench the door from her grasp. Through the opening, she saw the Comanche leader's eyes dark, keen, and searching. They held no fire of cruelty, only the hard recognition of a storm that threatened both of them. He spoke, the low rumble of his voice lost in the gale. Yet his hands did the talking. A sweep toward the blizzard, a point at her cabin, a glance back to the men astride their ponies. The request was plain: shelter. Clara swallowed against the dryness in her throat. She looked past him at the other 8. They loomed like phantoms, their outlines shifting in the snow, their robes pulled tight, their horses trembling against the cold. To turn them away is to sign their death warrant. For a moment the prairie widow and the Comanche chief locked eyes. In that instant, Clara did not see a savage, nor did she feel like the haunted ghost of the Llano. She saw only another human soul shouldering responsibility for the lives that depended on him. Slowly, she gave a nod and pulled the door wide. The 9 men entered, bringing with them the bitter scent of snow, leather, and horse. The cabin, once lonely and spacious, shrank around their sheer size and presence. Yet they moved with surprising quiet, moccasined feet making little sound on her plank floor. The leader barked a short command to Coda. She would later learn his name, and the men obeyed without hesitation. Buffalo robes, heavy with ice, were peeled away to reveal broad shoulders, scarred arms, and the beads and leather strips of warriors seasoned by countless trials. They set their weapons, a bundle of rifles and bows, in a neat pile in the corner, an act of trust, or perhaps a way to keep them close. Clara could not tell. She stood by the stove, her hand brushing the iron skillet, her eyes flitting nervously from face to face. She read their expressions like signs on a trail. Dakota's remained calm, carved into an unreadable mask of authority. A few of the younger men let their eyes wander, curious about her simple world, the old clock ticking steadily, the battered books stacked neatly, the faded photograph of Silas and herself on their wedding day. But one man's stare pierced sharper than all the others. He was lean, with wolfish features and eyes alight with suspicion and something harsher hostility. His name, she would hear later, was Kohana, and every twitch of her hand, every breath, was measured against the possibility of betrayal in his mind. Another lingered near the back, tall but less imposing than the rest. His gaze was steady, not hostile, but searching. He seemed to study her the way an artist studies his subject, quiet, intent, thoughtful. His name was Chaitin, where Kohana was coiled like a striking snake. Chaitin's presence felt like the watchful patience of a hawk. Dakota's eyes shifted to the simmering pot on the stove. He pointed, then motioned toward his men. Clara understood the request. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. She took down the mismatched tin bowls, some hers, some once belonging to Silas during his mining days, and ladled the venison stew into each one. Her hands trembled as she passed the bowls, braced for them to tear into the food like wild animals. But instead, they ate with measured silence, each bite deliberate, their manners more formal than she expected. When the bowls were empty, they returned them politely, each man giving her a slight nod. One of them even offered back a strip of dried buffalo meat. Clara forced herself to accept and chew, and in that small exchange, a silent agreement was forged. As night deepened, the storm outside raged harder, rattling the shutters like bones. Inside, the warriors unrolled themselves across the floor, wrapping in robes, content to sleep where they lay. Dakota remained upright, his back against the wall facing the door, a sentinel who would not rest. Kohana chose his place near the stacked weapons, hand never far from the knife at his side. Eyes locked on Clara as if she were the greatest threat in the room. The distrust in his stare chilled her more than the blizzard. And yet, as she settled into her chair with the Winchester laid across her lap, she found her gaze drawn to Chaitin. He had not lain down. He sat quietly in the lamplight, studying her not with suspicion, but with that same quiet intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she could not name. Clara Whitmore knew that sleep would not come. The storm outside might have roared like a beast, but the greater weight pressing on her chest was inside her cabin. She sat in her rocking chair near the stove, the warmth of the fire already fading, her Winchester lying across her lap like a trusted companion. Hours stretched on, measured only by the groan of the timbers and the shriek of the wind clawing at the shutter. Her eyes wandered again and again to one figure among the Comanche. Chayton was not lying down with the others. Instead, he had pulled a small square of tanned deer hide from his pouch, and with a piece of charcoal in hand, began to draw. In the flicker of lamplight, his concentration was absolute, his movements smooth and sure. He did not sketch the storm raging outside, nor the warriors resting on the floor. His strokes captured the details of her world: the stove, blackened with years of use, the creak of her rocking chair, the little bird Eli had carved, sitting lonely on the mantel. Clara caught her breath when their eyes met across the dim room. He did not look away, nor did he try to shield what he was creating. His gaze was direct, not hostile, but filled with a deep and searching curiosity. It unsettled her in ways she could not name. It was more intimate, more disarming than Kohana's obvious hostility. That first night passed without violence, but the storm outside showed no mercy. Morning did not arrive with light, only a heavy gray dimness pressing against the frosted window. Snow had piled high, and the wind still lashed at the walls as if determined to break them. They were trapped together, the widow and the warriors, bound by necessity. A rhythm formed as the hours dragged on. Clara cooked what she had, and the men shared their dried meat and pemmican. The tension had not vanished, but it softened, no longer a knife at her throat. The warriors spoke among themselves in low tones, their language carrying a steady cadence she could not understand. Clara sat mending a sack, her fingers moving through the familiar motions of needle and thread, letting the small task steady her nerves. It was during this fragile peace that a cry of pain broke the air. One of the younger warriors, no older than 18, slumped forward with a low groan. Clara's eyes widened as she saw the rough binding on his forearm. The wound beneath was angry and swollen, the skin red and hot, and a thin dark line already creeping upward. Infection. She had seen it before, left untreated. It would travel to his blood, and the boy would not survive the week. Dakota knelt beside the youth, his face set in grim lines. Around him, the others exchanged looks that carried no hope. They knew what it meant out here, in the cold, with no doctor in reach. Kahana's eyes burned as he swung his glare toward Clara, his suspicion sharp as a knife. He looked at her as if the very rot in the wound was somehow her fault. Clara hesitated only a breath. Then she laid aside her sewing and stepped toward them. Dakota shifted, his body a wall, his eyes narrowing in warning. But Clara met his gaze without flinching. She pointed to the boy's arm, then toward the small wooden chest in the corner, her collection of herbs and clean bandages. She raised both hands to show they were empty, her voice rough as gravel when she forced out the words. "Let me—" Dakota studied her, the weight of decision heavy in his silence. To trust her meant bending every instinct he had, yet to do nothing meant losing one of his own. He looked down at the boy's pallid face slick with sweat, then back at Clara. Whatever he read in her eyes convinced him. With a clipped nod, he stepped aside. Kohana spat out a harsh protest in his own tongue, But Dakota silenced him with a single command that brooked no argument. Clara knelt and unwrapped the filthy binding. The smell of rot made her stomach churn, but her hands stayed steady. She set water to boil on the stove and dropped in dried yarrow and golden seal. The pungent steam filled the cabin as she cleansed the wound. The boy hissed in pain, held firm by two of his companions. Clara crushed echinacea root into a poultice and smeared it across the angry flesh before binding it tightly in clean linen. Throughout it all, she felt Chayton's eyes on her. He had moved closer, watching not like the others, wary and suspicious, but with the quiet attentiveness of a student. He seemed to memorize the way she used each herb, the calm tone of her voice, even though the boy could not understand her words. When it was done, Clara rose stiffly, her back aching. She looked Dakota square in the eyes. She gestured toward the wounded youth and then mimed drinking water, touching her own chest as she said slowly, "Keep him warm. Water. Much water." Dakota's expression shifted ever so slightly. For the first time, something softened in his stern face. It was respect, freely given. He answered her with a slow, deliberate nod. The air in the cabin changed. A fragile trust took root. Even Kohana's glare could not smother it. That evening, as Clara checked the dressing once more, Chayton approached her. He held out the piece of deer hide. The sketch was finished. The mantelpiece, every detail drawn true, and upon it, the little bird Eli had carved. The likeness was so exact, it stole her breath. Chayton pointed to the bird and then to her, his expression questioning. Clara felt the sting of tears. She picked up the tiny carving, worn smooth by years of her touch. She walked to the door, opening it just enough to point out into the white fury of the storm, toward the hill now buried in snow. She pressed a hand to her chest and lifted 4 fingers the age Eli had been when he died. When she turned back, her eyes were unguarded. The raw ache laid bare for the first time in years. Chayton understood. His gaze softened, his face reflecting a comprehension beyond words. He knew this silence she carried was born of loss. He looked again at the drawing, then back to her, and with one careful motion, he drew a single line beside the image of the cabin. Strong, unbroken, standing against the storm. In that small act, Clara felt something shift. He did not see her only as a woman weighed down by sorrow. He saw the strength that had carried her through the years. And for the first time since she had buried her family, Clara felt the weight of her grief shared, even if only in silence. Chayton's charcoal left a single firm line beside the outline of Clara Whitmore's cabin, a mark unbroken, standing tall as if braced against the storm itself. In that simple stroke, he revealed what he saw in her, not merely a woman bowed by sorrow, but one who had endured, who had survived. In the quiet flicker of lamplight, a bond as strange as it was undeniable began to take shape, as fierce and unexpected as the blizzard howling outside. For 2 more days, the storm imprisoned them together. The prairie vanished into a white, shifting void where earth and sky became indistinguishable. Yet inside those 4 walls, something softened. The barrier between Claire and her guests was no longer so sharp. She had given one of their young warriors another chance at life, and his slow recovery testified to her skill. On the 3rd night, his fever broke. His breathing eased, and gratitude settled heavy in the room. The men acknowledged her not with words. They had too few in common, but with nods, brief touches to the chest, the language of warriors giving thanks. By the 2nd morning, The cabin no longer echoed with silence alone. The Comanche began to point at objects, offering her the names from their tongue. Tar for stove, Kutz for robe, Pia for mother. One of them spoke that last word while glancing at her, a smile tugging faintly at his mouth, and Clara felt her throat tighten. She returned the favor, speaking her own English words in exchange. Fire, water, bread. A bridge was being built in halting syllables, each word a stone laid across the chasm of culture and mistrust. Only Kohana stood apart. His face remained closed, his arms folded tight. He watched his companions grow comfortable with the woman as if it were betrayal. His dark eyes smoldered with the conviction that to share a language was to forget old blood. Now and again, he pulled Dakota aside, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, his gestures sharp with warning. But the chief would cut him off with quiet authority. Dakota had decided within Clara's walls there would be peace. As days dragged into nights, Chayton continued to draw. The charcoal seemed an extension of his spirit, each line a message his tongue could not shape. He sketched her hands while she kneaded dough, her profile bent toward the fire, the strands of hair that escaped their knot to frame her tired face. He never concealed what he was doing. His art was not meant to pry, but to speak where words failed. One afternoon, he unfolded a new hide and showed her something different. Not the confines of her cabin, but a wild scene of horses, manes flying, charging across the plains like water released from a dam. The movement was so alive she could almost hear the thunder of their hooves. Clara realized then that Chayton was not only a warrior, but an artist, one who saw the living spirit beneath all things. The sight stirred her to share in turn. She opened her most cherished possession. Aside from Eli's bird, a thick leather-bound book of poetry Silas had once placed in her hands. Its pages had grown as soft as cloth from her years of reading. She could not recite the lines across their language divide, but she showed him the print, pointing to the words, then pressing her hand against her heart. Chayton seemed to understand. He touched the page reverently, then pointed to his sketch of the horses and pressed his hand against his chest. It was a quiet exchange of souls, her poems, his drawings, two languages, yet one truth. That evening, Clara mended one of Silas's old shirts, a garment she no longer needed but could not let go. Chayton watched from across the fire. The lamplight gentled the strong planes of his face, softening him into something she had not expected. His hands, large and steady, might wield a lance, yet they also held the elegance of a man who could coax life from charcoal. After a long silence, he spoke a word in his tongue, soft and questioning. He gestured toward the shirt and the empty place beside her. The needle paused mid-stitch. Clara's breath caught. She understood what he was asking, who had once worn the garment. Her gaze lifted to the faded photograph above the mantel. Silas's arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them young and shining with hope. She swallowed hard, the word tasting foreign after so many years. "Husband," she whispered, pointing to the photograph. Silas. Chayton studied the image for a long while. When he looked back at her, there was no pity in his expression, only a grave recognition. He too knew what it was to walk with ghosts, to live in the company of absences. Without a word, he reached out not to touch her, but to rest his fingers lightly on the sleeve of the shirt she held. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried weight, a silent acknowledgment of love endured, of grief stitched into the fabric. Clara did not pull away. Their eyes met, and for a moment the cabin no longer felt like a prison carved out by snow, but a sanctuary of shared loss and fragile connection. On the morning of the 5th day, the storm surrendered. Clara woke to a silence unlike any before. The wind had died, leaving a world dazzling in new white. She pushed open the door, and snow toppled inside, light glittering across drifts that buried the prairie under a pristine shroud. Above stretched a sky too blue to believe. The warriors stirred, their purpose returning with the clear weather. They gathered weapons and heavy robes with swift efficiency, each man falling into the rhythm of life on the move. Clara felt a weight settle in her chest that surprised her sorrow. The silence she had once sought now threatened to crush her. The cabin would feel emptier than before, haunted not just by her dead, but by the living who had shared her fire. Dakota stepped before her, towering as a shadow in the morning sun. He extended his hand, palm upward, a gesture of respect. Clara looked down at it, her throat tightening, realizing this was no casual courtesy, but the solemn gift of a leader. In Dakota's open palm lay an eagle feather. Its base, wrapped in leather, dyed a deep crimson. Clara Whitmore stared at it, knowing enough of their ways to understand the weight of the gift. An eagle feather was no trinket. It was a symbol of courage, of strength, of wisdom. To place it in her hand was to honor her as an equal. Dakota spoke a single sentence in his language, his voice carrying the low rumble of solemnity. Though she could not understand his words, the meaning was clear. Gratitude, respect. Her hand trembled as she accepted the feather, her fingertips brushing against his callous skin. Warmth shot through her palm as she whispered, "Thank you." The men began to file outside, gathering their ponies from the drifts that half buried the lean-to. Their movements were quick, efficient, purposeful. They were warriors once more, returning to the wilderness. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms tightening around herself against the crisp air. Chayton was the last to leave. He paused in the threshold, framed in a shaft of brilliant morning light. For an instant he looked less like a man and more like a figure torn from some dream. In his hands he carried the roll of deer hide, marked with the charcoal lines of his long observations. He pressed it into her hands with care. His eyes held hers, dark and intense, and Clara felt as though he might speak. But instead, he lifted his hand, brushed his fingers softly against her cheek, his thumb grazing the ridge of her bone. The touch was feather-light, but it coursed through her like a jolt, stirring something long buried in her chest. Then he was gone, mounting his horse, following the others into the glaring white distance. 9 figures dwindled against the snow, swallowed by the vast horizon. Clara stood there until the last echo of their passing had faded, the eagle feather in one hand, the rolled hide in the other. The silence that returned to her cabin was not the same silence that had once ruled her days. It was not emptiness. It was memory, living and breathing, carried in every scratch of charcoal and every breath of wind. That night, by lamplight, she unrolled the deer hide. Among the sketches of her cabin and hearth, she found one last drawing, a portrait of her. But Chayton had not drawn the lines of sorrow that life had etched into her. He had drawn strength. It brought her to tears. For days afterward, she moved through her chores as though in a dream. The cabin felt vast and hollow, as though 10 souls had only just departed. She would set the coffee pot to boil and realize she had measured enough for more than herself. Her eyes often lingered on the eagle feather she now kept on the mantel, beside Eli's small bird. At night she studied the drawings, tracing the lines with her fingers as if they could return the warmth of his gaze. Something in her had shifted. The armor around her heart had cracked. For the first time in years, she caught herself humming as she worked. But peace on the plains was never built to last. The sun grew harsher, melting the snow into a slick of mud that painted the prairie brown. The thaw brought with it another kind of storm, one that had nothing to do with weather. His name was Gideon Blackthorn. Blackthorn had ridden into the territory 3 years earlier with more cattle than most men could count, a small army of hard-eyed cowboys, and the ruthless belief that land belonged to any man bold enough to seize it. By then he owned nearly every acre east of Prosperity Ridge. But what he lacked was water. His cattle had fouled his creeks, and the deep aquifers were running dry. Clara's land, however, was blessed. Silas had dug her well deep, tapping into a spring that never ran out. A small creek, born of that underground source, cut through the western edge of her homestead and stayed running even in the worst of summer. For 30 miles in any direction, it was the only dependable water. Gideon Blackthorn wanted it. He had tried twice before. The first time he sent a foreman with an offer so pitiful, Clara nearly laughed. She turned it down flat. The second time, he came himself, a large man with pale eyes and a smile that chilled more than it charmed. He doubled his offer and added a warning about how unsafe it was for a woman to live alone. Clara answered with the unflinching barrel of her Winchester. Blackthorn had ridden off with fury carved into his face, but men like him did not forget. And after the blizzard, he believed her weakened, her supply stretched thin, her spirit cracked. He smelled blood in the water. She saw them coming long before they reached her gate. A dark pillar of dust rose on the horizon, not the lazy drift of a few riders, but the heavy churn of a posse. Her stomach sank as she counted at least a dozen. She set her jaw, tethered Molly safely in the lean-to, and barred the shutter. The rifle rested in her arms, its weight familiar, its steel steady against her resolve. Gideon Blackthorn rode at the front, his hat low, his pale eyes scanning her cabin with a predator's patience. Beside him was Harlan Pike, his wiry foreman, with the look of a man who enjoyed cruelty. Behind them trailed a string of hired guns, grim and silent, their pistols hanging low on their hips. They fanned into a half-circle, a formation meant to intimidate. Blackthorn's voice carried across the empty prairie, oily with arrogance. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called, "we've come to settle our business once and for all." Clara stepped outside, blinking against the harsh sun. She held her rifle at her side, barrel low but ready, her posture leaving no doubt she would use it. "There is no business between us, Mr. Blackthorn," she replied, her voice calm though her stomach knotted. "This land is not for sale." Blackthorn chuckled, the sound harsh and hollow. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood. I'm not asking any more." He lifted a hand, and his riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. "This is your last chance." "I'm afraid you misunderstand me," Gideon Blackthorn called out, his voice carrying across the flat prairie. "I'm not here to bargain. This is your final warning. You'll take my offer of $500, and by sunrise, you'll be gone. I've got the deed right here." He tapped the leather satchel hanging from his saddle, his grin curling into a sneer. "All it needs is your mark." Clara Whitmore's eyes narrowed. She stood tall in the doorway, her Winchester resting in her hands like an extension of her very will. "That deed's nothing but ink and lies," she said coldly. "This land was granted to my husband by the state. It belongs to me now." Blackthorn laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He swept his hand toward the endless prairie. "The state. The state is weeks away from here. Out here. Strength is the only law, and as you can see, I've got more than enough of it." His men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands brushing the butts of their pistols, their eyes sharp and eager. The weight of threat pressed down heavy as the sky before a storm. Clara felt her pulse quicken, though her voice stayed steady. "This is my home," she said, "and the only thing you'll get from me is lead if you set one boot on it without my leave." Blackthorn's smirk dissolved into a scowl. Rage painted his face red. "You stupid woman," he snarled. "Did you think you could stand against me?" He jerked his head at his men. "Harlan, you and a couple boys, get in there. Pack her things. We'll escort her to town ourselves." Harlan Pike and 2 riders dismounted, smirking as they began their slow, confident walk toward the cabin. Clara's breath hitched. She knew she could bring down one, maybe even 2, before they reached her. But after that, she'd fall. Still, she would not yield. She lifted the Winchester to her shoulder, pressing the stock firmly against her cheek. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Then came a sound she had not expected, the muted thud of unshod hooves on wet earth. From behind the low rise where Silas and little Eli lay buried, 9 riders appeared. They crested the hill in a line, dark against the blazing blue of the sky. They bore no war paint now, their faces bare, but their presence was more formidable than any color or stripe. Dakota sat tall at their center, his face carved from stone. To his right was Chayton, whose gaze immediately found Clara. The set of his jaw hardened as he took in the scene. To Dakota's left rode Kohana, his expression fierce, almost exultant, as though he welcomed the clash that was coming. Blackthorn and his men froze. Their mocking smirks vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. Fear slithered through their ranks. They had expected one woman to push aside. Instead, 9 Comanche warriors had risen from the earth itself to stand with her. Dakota urged his pony forward, his warriors falling into line with him. They formed a silent barrier between Clara's cabin and Blackthorn's posse. None reached for their bows or rifles. They didn't need to. Their very presence was weapon enough. Blackthorn's pale eyes darted between them, confusion twisting his features. "Well, what's the meaning of this? Who are these savages?" Dakota did not look at Blackthorn. His dark gaze turned instead to Clara. With a nearly imperceptible nod, he declared his stance without words. "We are with you." Clara's arms trembled as the tension drained from her body. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over her. She was not alone. Chayton's eyes never left Blackthorn. They burned with a cold fire Clara had not seen before. He knew what this man was, greed clothed in arrogance, a predator circling prey. He saw the danger aimed at the woman who had shown kindness, who had stitched wounds, who carried grief with grace. It was Kohana who shattered the silence. He spat into the dust at Blackthorn's boots and barked a single word in his own tongue, a curse, bitter and final. The meaning needed no translation. Blackthorn's face twisted with rage. "I have no quarrel with you people," he snapped. "This is between me and this woman." "Step aside." Dakota ignored him. He spoke instead in Comanche, his words calm yet unyielding, the voice of authority that none of his men would question. At his command, Chayton and 2 others dismounted. They moved to stand at Clara's sides, rifles in hand. Their stance was not aggressive, but their quiet readiness was more terrifying than if they had shouted threats. The balance of power shifted in an instant. Blackthorn's hired men were cowboys and bullies, used to throwing weight around in saloons and dusty streets, not facing Comanche warriors hardened by a lifetime of war and survival. Fear rippled through them. Nervous glances were exchanged. Hands that once reached confidently for pistols now trembled. Blackthorn's fury boiled over. Humiliation was a poison he could not swallow. He could not be seen as weak, not before his men. With a roar, he yanked his pistol free. To hell with this. This is my land fire on them. But his aim was not at Dakota or the warriors. His barrel pointed straight at Clara. He never got the shot off. The air split with the shriek of an arrow. It cut across the space faster than thought, striking Blackthorn's wrist. His revolver clattered to the ground as he screamed, the arrow driving straight through his hand and pinning it to the horn of his saddle. The world erupted. The Comanche moved as one, fluid and deadly. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. They were not 9 men. They were a single force, honed by battle. Cohanna loosed a cry of triumph as he knocked another arrow. Dakota's rifle cracked, its report sharp as thunder. Beside Clara, Chayton shoved her toward the cabin wall with one strong arm, shielding her as his own Winchester rose. His voice, deep and urgent, barked the single English word she understood perfectly. Inside, Chayton's command rang sharp and urgent, the one English word he had chosen for her in that moment. Clara Whitmore stumbled back against the wall, her rifle still clutched to her chest. The air outside cracked with sudden violence. Blackthorn's riders had expected a simple show of force, a woman cowed into surrender. What they faced instead was chaos. Some managed to draw iron, Harlan Pike among them, his pistol firing wild into the dust. Others loosed rounds that sailed high or sent dirt spraying near the ponies. The Comanche answered with deadly precision. Dakota fired once, clean and deliberate, and a cowboy dropped from his saddle without a sound. A hole punched neatly through his chest. Another warrior, riding bareback, fired on the move and struck Harlan Pike in the shoulder, spinning him off his feet into the mud. His pistol clattered away as he screamed in shock. Clara's back pressed hard against the cabin wall, her eyes wide as she watched. This was not the drunken swinging of fists she had once seen outside the saloon in Prosperity Ridge. This was war swift, merciless, efficient. The warriors flowed with their horses, the men and animals moving as one. They reloaded in motion, shifted positions like water slipping over stone. Against them, Blackthorn's men looked clumsy and untrained. Cohanna was a storm unto himself. His bow sang 3 times in the space of heartbeats, each arrow striking true. One buried in a cowboy's thigh. Another found the neck of a horse, sending beast and rider crashing to the earth in a tangle of blood and mud. His face lit with savage joy, not simply fighting, but reveling in the violence he had long been denied. Something within Clara hardened. This was her home, her soil, her well, her family's resting place. These men had come to steal it from her. She would not stand idle. Lifting her Winchester, she leveled the barrel at a rider creeping to flank Chayton. She exhaled, steadied, squeezed. The shot snapped the air, and the man's hat flew away as he yelped, dropping low and scrambling for cover. Chayton flicked a glance toward her surprise, then approval blazing in his eyes before returning to the fight. He was no wild storm like Cohanna. He fought like a tactician, deliberate and calculating. A single shot dropped an enemy to the dirt. Then he shifted, positioning himself to guard Clara's line of sight while keeping pressure on Blackthorn's men. He was protecting her and directing the flow of the skirmish in the same breath. The battle burned fast, less than a minute from its violent birth to its abrupt end. But in that short time, Blackthorn's confidence shattered. His cowboys, hired guns unused to facing warriors who had spent their lives in combat, broke ranks. Fear rippled through them like prairie fire. Men wheeled their horses east, fleeing with desperate kicks, their retreat a shameful rout. The dust cleared, leaving only silence pierced by groans of the wounded. 4 of Blackthorn's men remained behind, 2 dead in the dirt, 2 writhing in pain. The man Clara had shot at scrambled on foot, stumbling into the distance like a frightened rabbit. Harlan Pike clutched his ruined shoulder, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and Gideon Blackthorn himself still sat his horse, broken, his pistol gone, his right hand pinned to the saddle horn by the hawk-feathered arrow that had pierced clean through his wrist. The cattle baron, who had ruled through fear, whimpered like a beaten child, his face streaked with tears and blood. Dakota advanced slowly, his pony stepping with measured calm until the chief loomed directly before Blackthorn. His eyes went to the arrow, then to Blackthorn's ashen face. Without a word, Dakota seized the shaft and snapped it free with a brutal twist. The barbed head remained buried, lodged in bone and leather. Blackthorn shrieked in agony. The Comanche leader's voice, when it came, was low and steady as a winter stream. He spoke in English, the words deliberate, each syllable weighed and chosen. "This land," he said, motioning with his rifle toward the cabin, "the well, the graves on the hill, they are under the protection of the Numu, my people." His gaze cut through Blackthorn's pain. "The woman here is a friend of honor. You will not return. You will tell your kind what happened on this ground. If you or any man comes again, none will live to carry the tale." He turned to the groaning wounded. With a sharp command in Comanche, 2 warriors dismounted. They stripped the rifles from the fallen men and heaved them roughly onto horses, treating them with no more care than baggage. They gathered up the riderless mounts, including Blackthorn's. Dakota fixed his gaze back on the cattle baron. "You will walk," he said, his English cutting sharp and clear, "and you will remember." Blackthorn trembled, his pale eyes wild with pain and fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only a strangled sob. The sight of him, once a predator, now reduced to pitiful prey, was almost too much for Clara to comprehend. Dakota turned his horse away, his warriors following. The confrontation was over, the verdict delivered. Clara stood in the doorway, her rifle still in hand, her breath coming quick, her heart hammering. She looked at the ground littered with weapons, bodies, and blood, then back at the figures riding away into the horizon. For the first time since the storm had carried them into her life, she understood fully. These men were not merely visitors, they were her allies, and Dakota's words, spoken with the weight of command, had drawn a line across the prairie that Gideon Blackthorn and men like him would never cross again. The Comanche gathered their spoils with practiced efficiency, rifles stripped from the fallen, horses gathered and herded into a small drove. Gideon Blackthorn, broken and whimpering, slid from his saddle. Clutching his ruined wrist, he staggered into the dust, shambling eastward like a man already half dead. His empire, his pride, all of it lay in ruins behind him. The warriors turned back toward the cabin. Clara Whitmore still stood at her doorway, her knuckles white against the stock of her Winchester. The air smelled of blood and gunpowder, the silence broken only by the moans of the wounded left behind. Chayton approached her slowly, his chest heaving from the fight. He stopped a few paces away, his dark eyes searching hers, looking not for fear, but for wounds. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his English careful, deliberate. Clara shook her head, her voice catching. "No, not hurt. Because of you." His gaze softened. He looked at the rifle clenched in her hands, then back at her. "You fight," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of respect. "I had to," she replied simply. Just then Kohana rode up, his face alight with a savage grin. From his belt hung a bloody trophy taken from one of Blackthorn's men. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes held no hostility toward her. He lifted his lance high in salute, gave a triumphant cry, and wheeled his horse into a circle before charging off with a whoop of victory. In battle, she had proven herself, and in his eyes she was no longer just a white widow on the prairie. She was someone who had stood her ground. Dakota gave Clara a final nod, the gesture heavy with meaning. The debt of shelter had been repaid in blood and protection. His duty to her was finished. With a quiet command, the war party began to move out. Driving their captured horses before them, they rode this time not into a blizzard, but into the golden haze of a setting sun. Their silhouettes dwindled against the prairie, dark forms growing smaller until they were only shadows merging back into the land that had birthed them. Chayton rode last. Just before cresting a rise, he stopped and turned in his saddle. His figure was framed against a sky ablaze with fire. He raised one hand, not a wave, but a solemn gesture of farewell. Then he was gone. Clara stood until the last dust had settled, until the sound of hooves had faded into memory. Only the groans of the wounded remained. 2 men lay dead, grim evidence of what had passed. Exhaustion, heavy and relentless, pressed down on her shoulders. She looked at the churned-up earth, the bloodstains, the scars left on her homestead. Her solitude had been broken twice now, first by storm, then by violence, yet she remained standing. Her home was still hers. With grim resolve, she fetched a shovel. The dead would not be left for coyotes. Whatever sins they carried, they were still men, and they deserved rest. She dug until twilight deepened into dark, the scrape of iron on soil the only sound. When she was finished, she stood among the new graves, their mounds fresh and raw beside the crosses of Silas and Eli. 5 years ago she had buried her hope there. Tonight, she buried her fear. Inside, the eagle feather lay on her table beside Chayton's drawings, relics of a chapter that already felt like legend. Clara realized she was no longer simply the reclusive widow of the plains. She was the woman who had harbored a Comanche war party, the woman who had stared down Gideon Blackthorn, the woman who had fought with her own hands to defend what was hers. The Comanche had named her Pierre-Ubu, a friend of honor. Weeks passed, and word of what happened spread like prairie fire. Blackthorn's broken men carried the tale eastward, each retelling swelling with awe. The name Clara Whitmore, once whispered with pity as the ghost of the Llano, was replaced by something else, the Comanche woman, a figure of defiance and respect. Blackthorn, maimed and humiliated, sold off his holdings and vanished. From that day forward, no one dared trouble her again. Her life settled back into routine, but it was no longer an empty solitude. The air around her carried echoes of what had been. Sometimes her hand brushed the eagle feather. Other times she unrolled the deer hide and traced the sketch of her own face, the one where Chayton had drawn not grief but strength. She often found her eyes drifting to the horizon, no longer with dread, but with a small ember of hope. One evening, as spring brought color back to the prairie, Clara saw a rider approaching from the west. Her hand reached for the Winchester out of habit, but her heart did not pound with fear. The way he sat his pony, the easy grace, it was unmistakable. Chayton, he rode alone. No war paint, no weapons of battle, only simple buckskins. He stopped at a respectful distance, then dismounted. Clara stepped from her cabin to meet him, her feet steady, her heart beating a rhythm of cautious hope. This time, he carried no drawings. He simply stood before her, the sunset catching the calm in his dark eyes. His English was stronger now, learned with effort, shaped by intent. "Clara Whitmore," he said, her name rolling with quiet certainty from his lips. "Chayton," she answered, and for the first time in years, a smile touched her mouth. "I came back," he said, as if nothing could have been more natural. "I see that," she replied softly. He glanced at her cabin, then at the land, and finally back to her. "This is lonely ground for one person," he said. "It has been," she admitted, "but it is still my home." He stepped closer. "A home needs more than one voice," he told her. "So the silence does not win." From a pouch, he drew out a small carving, a bird of pale cottonwood, its wings spread as if ready for flight. A mate to the one Eli had shaped with his tiny hands. Clara stared at it, then at him. There was no grand speech in his offering, no impossible promise of forever, only a quiet beginning. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she accepted the gift. His hand was warm, steady. In that touch, something new took root. It was not the story of a widow and a warrior from different worlds. It was the story of two survivors, finding sanctuary in one another. The future stretched before them, unwritten, for the first time in years. Clara Whitmore was not afraid to read it. In the unforgiving West, stories were not written in books but carved into the land itself by hardship, by honor, and by bonds forged in the fire of survival. Clara and Chayton's tale endures as proof that beneath division and scars, humanity can find a way. True strength is not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it with an open heart. And sometimes, true shelter is not four walls or a roof, but the voice of another, breaking the silence. Clara Whitmore's story reminds us of truths that speak across generations. Life will bring storms, some made of snow and wind, others of grief and hardship. We cannot choose when they arrive, but we can choose how we face them. Clara endured years of loneliness, yet when tested, she found the strength to open her door and her heart, even to those she once feared. The Comanche warriors, too, remind us that beneath differences of culture or tongue, there lies a shared humanity. Respect, kindness, and courage can build bridges where words may falter. Clara's act of trust led to protection, and her willingness to fight beside them turned strangers into allies. For those of us who have lived long enough to know both loss and endurance, the lesson is clear. True strength is not found in shutting the world out, but in choosing, again and again, to meet it with an open heart. Solitude can protect us, but it is connection that gives us meaning. In every season of life, we have the chance to face our fears, embrace our courage, and welcome the unexpected friendships that can change everything. Thank you for spending time with us on the frontier tonight. If Clara and Chayton's story touched your heart, we'd be honored if you liked this video, shared it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribed to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing forgotten legends and timeless tales of the American West to life.